So I just read Lorgar, Bear of the Word by Gav Thorpe, and it was okay. The book more or less tells the story of Lorgar growing up on Colchis, where he eventually creates and spreads the religion of the One. However, rather than seeing the story from Lorgar's perspective, the book is told from the perspective of Corphoron, and sometimes from the perspective of Nairo, a slave owned by Corphoron. Furthermore, the entire book is written as if it is a religious text, both in terms of word choice and textual structure, as every paragraph has a number indicating its paragraph number, chapter number, and then book number. Finally, there are also some fragments that take place right after Monarchia. For starters, I quite appreciate the choice to construct the book this way. Seeing as the word bearers are more or less the preachers of 40k, it's very fitting that our primer book is also written in character. Sure, it's a bit of a gimmick, but I quite like it. Another thing I liked was the focus on people's thoughts and interactions rather than the big fights and wars. Just in general, I already prefer it if books do not focus too much on the bolter porn, but especially for Lorgar's primer book this is very fitting, as Lorgar in general isn't very much of a fighter himself. He prefers to win via cunning and manipulation, rather than just by resorting to violence. Then there's a choice to make Corphoron the main character rather than Lorgar, but I have mixed feelings about this. On one end, it's again fitting to not tell the story from the perspective of the prophet, but rather from one of his disciples. But on the other hand, because of this choice we learn very little about Lorgar's personality. Furthermore, Corphoron is one of the most boring characters in the setting, and the book doesn't really make him interesting either. Corphoron is portrayed as a power-hungry egomaniac, who throws a tantrum whenever things don't go his way. And the book doesn't do much to explain his motives further. He likes power, he likes to ruin his powers, and he's a manipulative dick. But we don't learn any of the reasons for why he is the way he is or why he does the things he does. The exact same problem happens with Lorgar. We don't really learn anything interesting about Lorgar from this book, except for some of his war powers. For an example, Lorgar is capable of reading and understanding any scripture, and he regularly gets visions about the Emperor. But what I hoped to get from this book was some insight into his personality, which we don't get at all. He's just an extremely naive child that lets himself be manipulated and beaten into obedience by Corphoron. Characters aside, I'm also not a huge fan of the plot. The main story is quite boring. Lorgar just goes around conquering, with very little interesting things happening. Then there's also the fragments scattered throughout the book that take place after Monarchia, but they just feel random for the most part. The last one is quite cool as it makes some interesting suggestions about Lorgar's character, but there's nothing in the rest of the book that supports these suggestions. It's almost as if Thorpe wrote the book and then afterwards decided to throw this in to make the book seem more complex. Another gripe I have with this book is that the second half is quite confusing. The pace of the story increases dramatically and many events are just skimmed over. Characters suddenly act differently, but we don't get to see any character progression, for example. This also makes the endings seem quite random in my opinion. Finally, to end on a positive note, I really like the setting of the book. I saw someone describe it as Mad Max in 40k, and that's exactly what it is. Colchis is this weird desert hellscape filled with religious zealots driving around in construct-like vehicles, with a couple of cities here and there. To increase the immersion, Thorpe even came up with a different calendar system. His attention to details helps to paint a very nice image of Colchis for the reader. All in all, I'm giving this one 3 to 5 Black Library stars. It is the old cliché story of a naive child being abused by a manipulative bastard in the name of religion, but then it takes place in 40k. The setting is cool and there are some cool gimmicks, but the characters are as boring and cliché as the plot, so in the end I really cannot justify giving it anything higher than 3 stars. Then for the tier list. Lorgar Bear of the Word ends up between Magnus and Guilliman. While it might be cliché and while we don't learn much about the Primarch, it is still better than Guilliman's book because at least we get a story that fits the Primarch. On the other side, the Magnus novel definitely isn't perfect either, but it is much more creative and interesting than this one, and therefore Lorgar ends up below his buddy Magnus. Anyway, that's all I got for you today.
If you liked this video, please consider subscribing and click ringing the bell to appease the Great Horned Rat. For more lore content, please check my main channel and leave any book recommendations in the comments down below. I gotta get back to reading the next book.